Well, welcome to our fourth Lunch and Learn for 2023. Today, today's webinar is being sponsored by HCH Enterprises. So everyone should be muted when you join, and I'm going to have you stay on mute until the end. We can open it up and you can ask questions directly. There's also a question and answer function at the bottom of your screen, as well as a chat. So I'll keep an eye on that and get Robert any questions that you might have. We are recording this. I'm going to provide a link and a copy of the slides after the fact to everyone who signed up. So thanks for joining us today. Let's learn about getting federal grant funding for your projects. There is a lot to cover, so I want to get right to it, but I do want to give a proper introduction to our presenter here today. I'm very pleased to have Robert Zarnetsky with us. He's a seasoned change leader with 30 years of experience in government administration, consulting, contracting, and compliance. He's an expert in policy development, program execution, and evaluation, and has a strong track record of delivering government performance improvements at the federal, state, and local levels of government. He has extensive expertise in financial analysis, budget planning, operational budgeting, and is a skilled team leader who inspires colleagues to achieve their best. His current role as Vice President for Public Sector Consulting at HCH Enterprises, he's developed the firm's public sector consulting practice, built and grew all aspects of its operations and business development. He's also provided advisory services to municipal and county governments across several states and played key roles in shaping the firm's strategy for public sector consulting. Before that, Robert served as Senior Economic and Policy Advisor for the State of Rhode Island's Office of Pandemic Recovery. I'm sure that must have been an adventure. Prior to that, he was Town Manager for the town of South Kingstown, Rhode Island, and the New England Regional Administrator and National Lead Executive on State and Local Programs for the U.S. GSA, the General Services Administration. Robert holds a Doctor of Jurisprudence degree from the University of Oregon, a Master of Education Policy and Administration from Harvard, and a Master of Arts in Political Science from the University of Connecticut. Oh, and also a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science from Eastern Connecticut State University. So he has a very varied experience and lots of information to share with you today. So let's get to it. I think what we're going to do is we're going to start off here with a quick poll. For folks, we're going to just get some basic information here from you and simple yes or no question on this one. Can you see that poll, Robert?
Yes.
All right. So folks on the line here, if you could just let us know, in the last 12 months, have you applied for a grant? Oh, interesting. All right, let's end the poll here, and I can share those results for you right now. Can you see them?
Yeah.
Kind of evenly divided. All right, one more quick poll here. Sorry, I think I have to end that. Stop sharing. Thanks, Robert. I'm getting some good experience here on this poll question. All right, one more short poll to get us going here. If you haven't applied for grants, well, why not? We're just curious what I suspect a lot of you. Well, yeah, staff time I think is going to be a big winner. All right, we got a few more of you still waiting on answers on. Applying grants for your projects in the past, and we can share.
Interesting.
Okay. All right. That's really, I hope that's helpful for you. And if you wanted to go ahead and share your screen.
That's great. So
right, take it away.
It's a pleasure to be here today, folks. I am going to run through some slides, but I want folks to know I'm happy to have folks interrupt and ask questions throughout the presentation. We do have, I don't know, it's about 30 slides, so it's a significant number of slides, but I think we've got room here to sort of engage in some informal conversation. So if you have a question as I'm going through this, please just raise your hand. Janine's going to have to let me know that we've got a question
Will do.
because I'm not going to see it, but I'm happy to have that approach. So the purpose of today's meeting is really to just outline some of the funding sources that are available, sort of give some context to where we are. I will mention later on, but I'll mention it now. We're sort of in the golden age of federal grants for public infrastructure, and knowing how to put a proposal together can be very beneficial to those of us who care and love public infrastructure projects. Just to sort of set some context, before the pandemic, the American Society of Civil Engineers estimated that we had $100 billion annual shortfall in infrastructure investment across the country. That's a huge number. We had 7 million people in 2019 who had a water system failure, which of course can cause health problems and can certainly have a negative impact on the environment. And the EPA had predicted, again, before the pandemic, that we needed $743 billion over the next 20 years. And I think that base year was 2019, for the maintenance and improvement of water infrastructure in the United States. Things have changed since the pandemic. The pandemic has seen a number of acts of Congress that have put public funds into infrastructure projects, water and sewer projects in particular, but not just water and sewer projects, everything from bridges to broadband and water and sewer projects. The three main acts in the last few years that have had an impact are the American Rescue Plan Act, which made funding available to municipalities and specifically authorized the municipalities to spend ARPA funds on water and sewer projects. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and the Inflation Reduction Act have sort of rounded it out. And as we get into the slides in the next couple, we'll see that they're big dollars, they're big amounts. Most of this money has come through the existing programs. Most of this money, ARPA went directly to the municipalities, and many municipalities still have unspent ARPA funds. The rate of expenditure, the burn rate for ARPA funds has actually been surprisingly slow. At least to me, it's been surprisingly slow. And I think that to the Treasury, it's been surprisingly slow as well. They sort of expected those funds to move out much faster than they have. The last number I saw was about 2 months ago. It looked like we still had about 60% of the ARPA funds in accounts held by municipalities. They had not put that money out into projects as of a couple of months ago. And I think you're going to see those funds sort of trickle out over the course of the next year and into 2024. The interesting thing about ARPA funds from water and sewer project perspective is this: those funds must be under contract. Every municipality must have ARPA funds under contract by December 31st, 2024. So if they've been trying to get those funds into projects that are complicated in some way, they may have difficulty. Municipalities may have difficulty putting those funds to sort of soft projects that require some analysis and require fitting into the uniform guidance for grants and fit into the Treasury guidance for the ARPA fund expenditures. So as you get into later into 2023 and into 2024, water and sewer folks should be looking at what is happening with their municipal funds, because you're a good default place to put those monies. If you've got, shovel-ready projects and the municipality is having trouble as it comes up to the deadline for expenditure, that's a good place to be looking. I didn't mean to go too deep into that, but it is a strategy that everyone who is working on water and sewer projects should keep in mind over the course of the next, we're in less than 18 months now. But generally speaking, the funds from the ARPA, the IIJA, and the IRA have gone into the traditional programs. They're just additional funds available in the traditional programs that you all know and love. Brookings has identified where we are in this universe right now as the start of the infrastructure decade. They note that between the IIJA and the IRA, $1.25 trillion will be put into transportation, energy, water resources, and broadband. That's a lot of money. Looking at just to sort of get a sense of how big these numbers are. Between ARPA, the IIJA, and the IRA, we have spent, Congress has committed more funds to infrastructure improvement than were spent on World War I, World War II, the Korean conflict, and Vietnam combined. This is an extraordinary commitment of federal funds for infrastructure improvement. This is a breakdown of where these funds are going. You'll note that transportation is taking the lion's share, energy is taking a huge bit, but watershed projects are still in excess of $100 billion. So there's a lot of money out there, and this is not including the ARPA funds. So there's a lot of money out there. Just looking at the IIJA, this is the Northeast commitment that we know about. This is a report from Brookings from 2 months ago. So as of February, we were looking at these numbers, total dollar amounts on the left for the Northeastern states and the percentage federal commitment on projects. So in Massachusetts, the feds have committed to spending 90% or providing 90% of the funds necessary for the approved projects. Connecticut, that number is 96%, and in New Jersey, it's 98%. This is a major shift away from where we've been historically. Since the 1980s, the federal government has had fewer and fewer grant dollars going to municipalities. The line has been a steady, pretty steady decline over that 30-year period. 35-year period. There was something of a bump in the 2013-14 range, and it got a little bit better, but really it has not been a very good story for federal grants since the 80s until really the pandemic. And what we see here is the drinking water state revolving fund numbers just absolutely spiked during and after, because of the legislation we've just talked about passed during the pandemic. It's a huge increase in the commitment the federal government is making. In water, same story. Sorry about the graphic. I can't find a clean version of this. But again, the story is the same. The legislation that we've talked about has just jumped those numbers tremendously. Now, you'll see that the commitment expected from the Fed, gray bar, is the baseline. Then you've got a one-time appropriation. This is sort of special project infusions, and then the corresponding commitment that will be coming from the states. So you're really looking at increases across the board. You're seeing an increase in your baseline. You're seeing an increase in discretionary funds. This is where the grant applications really are going to kick in. And you're seeing an increase in the state commitment, which may be baseline or may also be competitive grants. So you got to pay attention to what's happening with their state funds, because some of those are going to flow just as a matter of programmatic administration, and some of those are going to end up being competitive grants. So the trick in this kind of environment, where there's more money than there has been in 35 or 40 years, is to figure out how to be ahead of the curve, right? You want to know when the money is going to be available. You want to know when the grant notifications are coming out. You want to know how to tap into these funds. And the first step here is really to get with SAM, get on SAM. SAM is basically the federal government's social security number for municipal governments and for businesses. Most municipalities are already registered with SAM because they receive federal funding in one form or another already. Although some of the smaller municipalities that we encounter have never had to register with SAM, and under ARPA, actually, Everybody should have registered. I don't think I can think of anybody who hasn't. There are some municipalities that chose, not in this region, not in the Northeast that I can think of, but some municipalities that chose not to accept ARPA funds. They may not be registered with SAM, but your municipality, and if you're in this webinar, should be registered with SAM. It has a unique identity number for the municipality, and that number is going to be an important number for anyone applying for grants to have. You're going to need that number. The next thing you want to do is you want to make sure that you're registered with grants.gov and that you've got working knowledge of how grants.gov works. Grants.gov is basically the clearinghouse for all information about federal grants. It is federal grants. It's each of the federal agencies, and it's a whole host of, well, we can see here it's about 3,000 grants that were listed as of, I think this was Tuesday or Wednesday of this week. There's a lot of federal grants out there, and developing, a keyword strategy so that you're finding the right grants is going to be important. But getting familiar with grants.gov is a first and important step. There is, I will point out, if you look at the upper left-hand corner, there's a whole tutorial or set of tutorials. This is just a slide, so I'm not going to be able to show you what happens when you hit that drop down, but you'll be able to find videos and information on how to apply for and how to administer federal grants. And they've got some really good training materials out there. EPA in particular has produced really good videos on how to apply for and administer federal grants. Well worth the time. It does take several hours to sort of go through those materials, but if you've got the time, it really is a wonderful tutorial and well worth the effort. There are also, I will note, some foundations, though this was more true before we saw the huge spike in federal funding. There have been historically private foundations that do provide funding for water projects, particularly water projects that have an environmental or social benefit. So it's worth remembering that your only source isn't necessarily the federal programs or the state programs. You can look to private foundations, and where you've got a project where there's a really cool, a really interesting environmental or human services component, it may be worth spending some time looking at these foundations in particular. And that brings me to an important point. In this environment, it's important for government employees to think entrepreneurially. This is a very unusual environment. It's I suppose, a target-rich environment, if you want to think about it that way. There's many different grant funding programs or grant programs out there that are available to municipalities, to program managers. And we really are in an environment where we need to identify those opportunities and sort of figure out how to make a pitch. We've all sort of become salesmen in this environment to some extent. So here are some of the key things that I think folks have got to keep in mind as you start looking around and trying to figure out how to tap into these funds. The first thing is, of course, to identify those funds and getting on grants.gov, playing around, talking to your colleagues, attending webinars like this, figuring out what's going on in terms of the federal programs, the state programs, is obviously a fundamental step. You've got to figure out where the money is and where and how it's going to move. You need to then understand what the criteria are. What are the guidelines and what are the eligibility criteria for each of the programs that is being talked about in your circles, that's being written about in newspaper and trade magazines, what's being said about these programs. And then the third step, of course, is to write the proposal. Successful proposals require you to go through those steps, to understand the sources, to understand the requirements of the sources, and then it requires you to develop a good plan around the project. The historic reality around grants is that it's very competitive. Now, things are going to get a little bit better, but only about a quarter of all of the grant applications that are submitted historically are funded. Things may be better now that there's more money, but it's not going to be, a matter of just throwing together some poor quality grant and being able to say, hey, I sort of did what you were asking, so you should fund me. It is really the case that the grant reviewers care about the quality and the completeness of the information that goes into the grant. Half of the grants that are not funded because they are incomplete or the information that's provided is inadequate. Getting the application right, filling the application with good, solid, defensible, logical information is the surest way to guarantee your success. Historically, and I would argue even now that there's more money, it's still absolutely imperative to do that. One thing that I will note is, and I've already sort of touched on this first bullet up here is really meant to point out that there are local funds available, and that ARPA strategy that I started with is an example of where water and sewer folks should be, sort of keeping their eye on the local ball. We tend to think that all grants flow from the federal government, and while that's true, 75% of all water and sewer projects in this country historically have had federal funding to support them. 25% don't, though, and just because a lot of money comes from the federal government doesn't mean that you can't find local funds or private foundation funds. Think creatively, and you're going to find a way to meet the full budget needs of a project. And as we get into this, that's also an important thing because even the federal grant makers are going to want to know how you're dealing with your budget gaps. If they are only providing 90% or 80% of a project, what's the where are you going to get the match from? And characterizing your project as needing only X number of dollars because you've taken care of Y dollars can also put you in a more competitive environment or a more competitive position. Look at the funder's mission, look at the geographic focus that the agency has got. There's quite often a tight tie to an environmental or a social requirement, and where you can make those connections, you're going to put your grant proposals in better stay. Sources for identifying. There are numerous online databases. Grants.gov is free. And it's comprehensive with regard to federal programs, but there are grant directories and databases online that you can access for a fee. Some of those fees are relatively low, and they can be a nice way to augment your searches. Some of the databases that are available for a fee are designed to be user-friendly, designed to be very effective and efficient tools for folks to use. So grants.gov can be a little bit cumbersome. There are some online resources that are easier to use, but they typically come at a price. That price isn't always high, but there is typically a price. And develop relationships with the funding organizations. You should try to touch base with the folks who are running the state revolving funds in your state. You should talk to folks in the federal agencies where you can get them, because information is still a human, it's still a human function. It's not all computer-based. There's still a real need to talk to real people and understand what's going on. You often find things out through professional networks that you're not going to find out online. And I believe I have frozen. Oh, no, there we go. All right, let's see if we can get through.
Little too quick on the trigger there, Robert.
Yeah, look at that. All right. These are typical eligibility criteria. None of this is going to be of any surprise to anyone. key sections of the grant, though, and these are things to keep in mind. One of the things that I try to encourage our clients to do is have files that are grant application ready. You know, one of the things we find all the time is that people want to wait until the grant notice comes out and then write from scratch. You know, okay, they want this, that, and the other thing. We'd better scramble to get this, that, and the other thing put together so that we can respond to this this NOFA. You don't need to do that. You can really get your files ready to go and have sort of a summary of what your community's needs are, a summary of the demographics of your community. You know what projects are going to be coming down the line for the next 4 or 5 years. You can write narratives that are 80, 90% done, that are ready to put into a grant application. And I encourage you to do that. It saves a lot of time, it saves a lot of hassle, and what tends to happen is you don't end up with inadequate information going into a grant application because you've started with more than you're going to need. If you're continuously adding to that file, if you're continuously refining that narrative, when it comes time to tweak it for a particular application, you're going to have a better application. You're going to have a better proposal because you're not starting from scratch. You're starting from a well-developed set of information to begin with. And that's important because the one thing about applying for grants is the deadlines really matter. If you miss the deadline, you're done. Now that is less true with the private philanthropic grants, but for the government grants, they are drop dead dates because the federal government and the state governments are very concerned about making sure that everybody is treated equally. And deadlines are an equalizer for everybody. They really do matter. So having your materials in a good place before you even start the grant writing or the proposal writing process can make a big difference. A strong narrative and a compelling outline of what you're trying to achieve is absolutely imperative. You've got to explain, you've got to tell your story well. And I would encourage folks to think about your proposal in that way. It is literally a story. It has a beginning, a middle, an end. It has a goal. It has villains. It has heroes. You know, the villains may be the ravages of time on a system that's 50 or 60 years old, but you want to think about your narrative in terms of a story so that the reviewer understands what you're trying to accomplish. Sometimes it seems kind of silly, but if you're thinking about your story as having a beginning, a middle, and an end, having villains, having heroes, having a strategy, it really does tend to produce a narrative that is engaging and easy for a reviewer to read. I don't know if folks have ever participated in grant reviews, but the way that this is typically done is the same way that you see contract reviews, and you may have participated in a contract review if you haven't done a grant review. But typically the grants come in and there's a panel of reviewers. Each reviewer is assigned a set of grant proposals to review. They read them. The team that was assigned to read those proposals gets together and they assign scores to those. They talk about the information that's presented. The most compelling story tends to win. The proposal that has the clearest explanation of the problem that's being addressed and the clearest explanation of how that problem is going to be overcome tends to be the one that scores highest. Having good budget information is part of that story. It's not entirely separate from the narrative, but just having a nice, clean, concise budget makes a huge difference. Writing clearly and effectively is absolutely critical. Again. So what's in the narrative? Your narrative should address these sorts of things, right? What's the cost? What are the costs of your equipment? What's the cost of engineering? You should be thinking about the project and telling the story about the project in terms of all of the elements of the project. Detailed explanation of what's going on with this project. This was sort of out of place, but I will note that you should be thinking and in fact describing, so it's not completely out of place. I understand why the person who put the slide together put it here. You should be talking about what you're doing in a holistic way. So when you're writing your proposal, you don't just have a budget that says this is our expenses and this is our costs and you know that's just all there is to it. You should be describing in some detail all of the funding sources that you're tapping. The voters approved a bond which covers 25% of the total cost of this project. We've taken loans through the revolving loan program, but we're still in need of this component that hasn't been funded yet. That's why we're applying for this grant. You should be explaining to the grant reviewer in clear, concise ways the totality of the project, the totality of the problem that you're trying to resolve, and all of the component pieces, all of the funding sources, all of the activities and approaches that you've been taking to solve that problem. They want to see the whole picture. The reviewer wants to understand that if this grant is approved, a major problem has been solved. And the more information you can give to ensure them that the problem has been totally solved, the totality of the problem has been solved, the better off you're going to be, the more likely your project is to be funded. All right, and that does mean, you know, being very detailed in your explanation of the problem and your explanation of the costs associated and the funding mechanisms associated with addressing that. Best practices can be a really powerful tool in writing a narrative. Talk about what others have done. If you're using another municipality or another country's practices as your model, detail it. Explain what those practices are. Explain what you're doing that merits their attention. Why this is going to work. You've seen somebody else do this and it worked in their case, and you have reason to believe it's going to work in your case for the following reasons. Make sure that you explain who's going to be responsible for delivering the project. What's the plan? Who's going to be doing what? How are you going to monitor success through the construction or through the delivery of the project? And how are you going to address problems as they arise? Again, the reviewers are looking to put money into projects that they know are going to succeed. Your job as the writer of a proposal is to give them absolute confidence. Again, this is sort of back to that idea of we're in business now. Think of the grant reviewers as a bank executive reviewing an application for a loan. Think about what a business would have to do to convince someone that this is a good place to put their money, that giving a loan in this case is good because it's going to produce a productive and effective project. They're looking to make sure that the grant is going to be completely successful, and everything we can do to reduce uncertainty in the mind of the reviewer is going to put us in a better position. That also includes in public projects having a description of how you're going to be communicating with stakeholders. How are you going to talk to the public? How do you make sure that NIMBYism isn't going to kill this project, or that some environmental concern with the project isn't unmanaged, that it is in fact a concern that you've understood, that you've identified, and that you've got a strategy for addressing. Those things are important to reviewers. Again, for anyone who's sat on a review panel, it's something like that. Well, they didn't think about this problem that I know is going to arise. They didn't address it. I think that could kill their project. That's real. I mean, that's the kind of conversation that happens during those grant reviews. If you are doing things like using project software, anything you can do that is going to demonstrate that you've thought through addressing issues as they arise and that you've got a real plan that you're going to be able to implement, that's powerful stuff, that's useful stuff. Collaboration is something that is, a real hot topic for federal and state grant makers. Increasingly, especially in the Northeast, where we have so many very small jurisdictions, increasingly grant makers want to see partnering between jurisdictions. And it can be a really powerful tool, one, because the grant maker knows that their money is going to go further. Think about it from the federal agency's perspective. If you've got a project that reaches across 2 congressional districts, for example, you've got Congressman A and Congressman B who are going to be able to cut ribbons on the project. That's good. That's good politics, but it's also good policy because you're reaching more people and you're reaching more of the constituents that everybody's trying to serve. Partnering is good for that reason. It's also good, though, because it brings the expertise in from multiple communities, and that is reassuring to grant makers as well. If Town A has got somebody who's just super good at the environmental side and Town B's got somebody who's just super good at the administrative side, it makes your application stronger for substantive reasons as well. Clear communication is important. And again, having broader projects means that you're going to likely be able to communicate with all of the potential stakeholders. Back when collaboration wasn't the watchword, you often had facilities sited in places where the negative impacts would be downstream. Grant makers are aware of and are concerned about the possibility of downstream consequences. Having a collaboration with everybody downstream increases the likelihood that the project will not fail for social, political, or unaccounted for reasons. Getting more people involved means that the problems will be identified and addressed, and a proposal that writes to that fact is more likely to be funded than one that does not. Good news is folks are cooperating. Over 75% of local government recently reported that they have partnered with other organizations to achieve a water or sewer project, which makes sense. It's the nature of the projects. Measuring success is going to be an important thing. Make sure that your your response to the grant request addresses how you're going to measure things. How do you know if you've succeeded? It's easy to say, we'll know we succeeded when we've built the plant. Yeah, okay, that's good. I mean, yes, the plant is up. The brick and the mortar have been put down. That's useful. But what are the goals and objectives, and how are you going to measure those over time? Increasingly, federal grant makers are looking for data collection that speaks to outcomes and impacts. It's not just data on the construction, but what is the effect on public health? What's the impact on the economy? Long-term projections for what the far-reaching implications of the project are, and a means of collecting information to demonstrate that those impacts have been measured. That's what folks are moving toward looking for. And with all of this money on the table, we're going to see a lot of movement in that direction over the next few years. And by the way, stakeholder feedback is a major piece of that. Folks want to know what the outcomes and impacts are as perceived by the public that's being served. Long-term sustainability, this is the same set of concepts, so I'm going to skip through it. I think we're running a little long here, so I don't want to spend too much time here. Lessons learned, case studies, and addressing common challenges are also things that you should be thinking about integrating into your proposals. Lessons learned are basically, what have you learned locally? What is it that your experience tells you, and how have you taken what you've learned and built it into the plan that you're proposing should be funded? Case studies, examples of other jurisdictions that have had success tackling the problem. This is tough. I mean, doing all of this research takes time and energy, but if you know of something that has been successful, that tackled the same problem that you're trying to tackle, being able to point to those good examples, drawing on the data that they've got from their project, that can be a very powerful tool in a grant proposal. And again, back to addressing the challenges, making sure that you've got a clear statement in your proposal about how you are going to overcome problems as you go through the project is essential. So what are those challenges? It's things like funding gaps. Projects do have cost overruns. What are you going to do to in fact, half of all projects, roughly half of all projects in the water and sewer space run into some level of cost overrun. What's the plan for dealing with those? What's the plan for dealing with the cost overruns and funding gaps as you go forward? Regulatory compliance. What's your regulatory compliance strategy? This doesn't typically have to, you don't typically have to spend a lot of time in the narrative on this, because elsewhere in the proposal, you're going to have to delve into this. But it makes sense to tip your hat in your narrative everywhere you can to say, we're going to make sure we comply. And that, that can be relatively light touch, but reminding the reviewer that you're keenly focused on compliance is helpful. Now, what we've talking about here is a lot of effort. There's a lot of stuff going on to make all of this fall into place. A lot of research, a lot of writing, a lot of prep work, a lot of making sure that your files are in good shape. You've got the information in a readily accessible form and location. All of this takes time and energy. And as the poll we put up at the beginning of this session indicates, not everybody's got the time. We're talking about public organizations that are often underfunded. It's hard to find the resources in-house to do this. So there are a lot of folks out there who provide technical assistance. HCH is one of those companies, but there's a lot of companies out there that do this sort of work. I want to offer a framework for understanding how to evaluate what potential outsourced assistance looks like in the grant space. And this is the model we use at HCH. I think it's a good model. It's one that I would recommend you sort of use to compare anybody who's in this space. We worry about the obligations of the municipality. How do we make sure that what do we do in the design to make sure that you are complying with all of the requirements of the grant maker? There's a visioning, and the writing comes into the visioning dimension. What is it that you're trying to achieve? How does your project fit into the overall municipal goals and objectives in the long haul? What are you trying to accomplish with this project? There's an environmental aspect, and it ties to the quality of life, which ties to the long-term strategic plan, or the plan for the comprehensive development of the community. Tying all of those things together is a necessary thing in order to be at a place where you can drop good information in to a proposal that's going to say to a grant reviewer, this is a community that understands how the things it's doing interrelate, and it has a real strategy here that makes a difference in people's lives. Less of an issue with water and sewer projects, but it's also important to keep in mind what the impacts on the community are. With sub-grantees, when you're talking about working with nonprofit organizations or community groups, making sure that you've got a communication strategy and a compliance strategy if they're receiving federal funds is extremely important. If they're going to be beneficiaries and only beneficiaries, you don't have to worry about it too much. But if there's some partnership that involves other groups, you've got to have a strategy for making sure that you're managing their projects. You've got to look at the capacity of them to be effective partners, and you've got to look at the capacity of those organizations to participate in the administration of the program over time. What we do is we write different things using different writers. And this is I think, big deal. When you look for technical assistance in the private sector, you're going to find that there's a lot of small shops that will offer a grant writer or two who write on everything. You know, they're experts in everything. They write to FEMA, they write for transportation grants, they write for social service grants, and that can work. I mean, it's clearly the case that, you know, there are just folks who process information in an effective way and can provide a good, competent presentation on broadband and a good, competent presentation on transit systems. It's possible to do that. But what we've decided is a better approach at HCH is we try to make sure that we've got a pool of writers who specialize in the various categories, because there are technical requirements that are different for sewer projects than there are for housing projects. And we think it's important to have folks who are specialists to some extent. So we've got a whole list of folks across the country who we call into various projects as the need arises. We do the same thing with regard to our grant administrators. We make sure that we've got the right person for the post-award administration of projects, because knowing something about water and sewer is important if what you're doing is managing a water and sewer project. So I would suggest that that is best practice. Again, you know, just observation about the state of the consulting business around grant assistance. With all of this money coming, what you don't want to happen is to have a grant writer who's stumbling through an application because they don't have the expertise in the area that hired them to help with. And that's my presentation. I'm happy to answer any questions folks may have.
All right. Yeah, thank you, Robert. We're gonna stop sharing your screen so we can see. All right, great. I don't see any questions out there yet, but let me start off the conversation. So a lot of questions that I get from some of our members that are trying to develop some innovative processes for biosolids management, for example. Yeah, looking for funding to pilot these things, to maybe do a scale up at a treatment facility. How would you advise those folks? They're not really municipalities, but maybe they should team with municipalities. How would you answer that question if you were me?
So the folks seeking the funds are who? Where are they coming from?
They're innovators, technology,
so companies,
startups,
companies.
Yeah.
So it's a tricky problem because most of the programs that we discussed on the slide saying, remember, most of the funding that is coming out of the recent legislation is going through the established programs.
Yeah.
And those established programs are designed to be beneficial or to have the beneficiary be a municipality or a local authority. So it's a bit of a trick. It does make sense for businesses to look to municipalities and to the authorities. The challenge, of course, there is for the municipalities and the authorities, that's a procurement activity. So it is a bit tricky. It's harder to find grant funding for for-profit businesses. Not all grants prohibit it. And you know, if you're a small business that's got an innovative technology, the first approach would be to look for opportunities for unsolicited proposals. If what you've got is truly an innovative sort of one-off, you're the only folks doing it, there is a method in the federal procurement, the federal acquisition regulations that allows you to present to a federal agency and say, look, we've got this technology that nobody else has got. We think that you have this need for that technology and we'd like to sell it to you. The feds aren't going to start buying though for local authorities or municipalities. So it's a tricky problem there. There is the unsolicited proposal exception to the procurement requirement of full and open competition in most states, and municipalities often follow suit there. So that may be a method. The other thing that you can do though is register. If you're a small business with an innovation on water or sewer technologies, register in the grants.gov. Some of those grants are going to be available to for-profit organizations, and some of those are going to be available for nonprofit organizations that partner with for-profit organizations. So there's a couple of different ways to slice it, I guess.
I'll keep that in the back of my head, but I was also thinking, yeah, maybe have them team up with a university. They're very good at getting grants.
Yep.
We have a lot of questions coming in now, Robert. So
Okay.
thank you for answering that. Some of these may be quick, but is HCH tracking greenhouse gas reduction fund at all?
We've not been. We don't have a client who, well, I say that. We're tracking all of the federal grants all the time. So by tracking at the baseline, I mean literally just watching what the federal agencies are saying about timelines for distribution. So if there's a publication from EPA that has discussed this, or if Energy has put information out on it, someone at HCH has got that notification. But I don't have any clients right now who are doing
All right, fair
greenhouse
enough.
gas reduction, so I don't have a detailed engagement.
Here's an interesting question. What are the best questions to ask a potential consultancy to establish if they're the right match for your needs?
Yeah, so I think that what you want more than anything else, and this is me speaking as a former municipal guy. So two things, I guess. First is I want to know that you're going to be able to work with me on my terms. I want to know that the consultant is responsive to most of the northeastern communities are relatively small towns. I don't need a Deloitte. I shouldn't name a name, but I don't need a large firm that is focused on large complex problems. I need somebody who's going to pick up the phone and answer my simple question quickly and responsively. I need somebody who's going to be able to respond to me in the environment where I'm operating. So if you're a small northeastern municipality or a mid-sized northeastern municipality, getting the right fit in terms of they understand how the cycles of municipalities work. The other thing is you want somebody who does understand the grant programs, has read through CFR Part 200 a dozen times and knows the uniform guidance on grant administration, knows the regulations around the federal grant program for which they're applying. And that's, again, back to my point, we've got a team, we've got a pool of folks who focus on the various programs. So I can hook you up with somebody who is specializing in FEMA programs and somebody who's focused on the state revolving fund, the Clean Water Revolving Fund. I can get you the right people so that you're having the conversation on the subject with the right people in our organization. But I think that's important. So when you speak to any consultancy, you want to make sure that they've got expertise and access to people who will answer the phone and be able to answer your questions when they get on the phone.
All right. This one's about HCH. Do you have experience with the investment tax credit for energy projects such as solar and wind projects? That's a very unique expertise.
Yep, we have people who've done it. I've not personally done them, but I do have people on staff who've worked with the investment tax credit for energy projects.
All right, here's another question for you. Are quasi-state agencies eligible for grants? For example, if they wanted to pilot a PFAS removal technology at a treatment facility that was quasi-state.
So quasi-state depends on the state, and it depends on the agency. With quasis, you have to worry about the authority, the generic authority that they've been granted. Sometimes legislation will limit what they can do and how they're going to be treated. And then the state law on the programs, the grant programs, is also going to be controlling. So you got to look at each case individually. I wouldn't want to say yes or no. It's a matter of looking into what the organic authority of the quasi agency is and looking at the grant requirements.
So basically they're enabling legislation. If it allows them to accept grants, they should be okay.
That's correct. And grants within it's usually within some, specific area. They're authorized to conduct business with regard to X, Y, and Z. If the grant is for A, they're not going to be able to do it. But you look at the organic authority, the authorizing legislation for that quasi, and you look at the grant criteria, you figure out if there's an overlap, and if there is, then yes. If there isn't, then maybe. Then you gotta go dig in.
Yep. All right. So those are all the typed in questions. Does anyone else have questions? You can take yourself off mute, raise your hand, ask them directly. We'll just give you a minute or so.
So I will come back to just, thinking through again, how you want to work with consultancies. If the staffing problem is a real problem, then what you really should be thinking about with a consultancy is, if I were hiring staff, what would I ask them? And that's what you should ask your consultant, because you're essentially looking for staff augmentation at that point. You're looking for somebody to be an adjunct to your own staff.
Yep, I agree. Well, we are getting close to the end, but that was very informative. Lots of information in there. Thanks a lot, Robert. And I hope some of our members got some useful suggestions out of that, so that they can get some funding for some of these awesome biosolids projects. So thanks to HCH for sponsoring this and presenting today. And thanks to everyone for joining us on this beautiful Friday. I scheduled the next Lunch and Learn for May 12th about DryVac, a vacuum drying system you might be interested in. I'll send out more information on that later, but we have these lined up through October. So check our events page and please come back and join us again on a Friday and learn about something. Always looking for suggestions. If there's something you want to hear about, please let me know. But with that, I want to again thank you very much, Robert and HCH, and wish everyone have a great weekend.
Be well, folks. Thank you.
Take care. Thanks. Good afternoon, folks. Welcome to you early joiners. We'll be starting in 3 minutes or so, but welcome. Happy Friday. All right, well, welcome, folks. I'm going to share my screen, and then we're going to have Robert share his screen as well.